news on the Papyrus Global TV. My name is Christiana Babayo. Before we begin, here are the headlines. Military officers claim control of Guinea-Bissau after controversial election. Trump administration excludes South Africa from 2026 G20 summit, cuts its subsidies. Kenya scrambles to save key EU trade pact after court suspension. France's highest court upholds conviction of ex-president Sarkozy. Tunisia summons EU envoy over union meeting. Somalia dry spell pushes millions to the brink as aid slows. US group sues Apple over use of conflict minerals from DRC and Rwanda. And now the news. In a dramatic turn of events, military officers in Guinea-Bissau declared that they had taken complete control of the country on Wednesday, 26 November, seizing power just one day before the official release of election results. The takeover came shortly after the national elections in which both the incumbent Umaro Sissoko Embalo and his main challenger Fernando Diaz da Costa each claimed victory. Military spokesperson Dinis Chama announced on state television that the armed forces had assumed the full powers of the State of the Republic of Guinea-Bissau, citing the uncovering of a plan to manipulate electoral results. Gunfire was reported earlier in the day near the presidential palace and election commission offices, heightening fears of wider instability. Journalists describe routes to the presidential palace sealed off, with armed and masked soldiers manning checkpoints. The military announced the formation of a high military command for the restoration of order, indefinitely suspending all state institutions, halting the electoral process, shutting borderlands, sea and air, and suspending media operations nationwide. Outgoing President Embalo confirmed he had been detained. He described the development as a coup, though he said no violence was used against him. This abrupt takeover adds to yet another chapter to Guinea-Bissau's long history of political instability since its independence in 1974 and underscores the fragile nature of democratic processes in the country. The Trump administration has announced that South Africa will not receive an invitation to the 2026 G20 summit in the United States, effectively barring the African nation from next year's gathering. President Trump said this decision follows what he called a refusal by South Africa to formally hand over the G20 presidency to a U.S. embassy representative after the 2025 summit held in Johannesburg, a move the administration described as a breach of diplomatic protocol. As part of the same action, the US will stop all payments and subsidies to South Africa, with the White House framing the exclusion as a response to alleged human rights abuses against white South Africans, specifically claims of violence against Afrikaner farmers. The reaction from Pretoria was swift. The government rejected the move as regrettable, reiterating that South Africa is a founding G20 member and should not be subjected to unilateral exclusion by any single state. Global observers warn that this development may deepen tensions between the United States and allied nations in Africa, undermining confidence in multilateral norms and the G20's integrity. East African Court of Justice has suspended the implementation of the Kenya-European Union Economic Partnership Agreement, prompting a swift action from the government of Kenya. The suspension, issued on November 24, 2025, follows a challenge by a non-governmental think tank arguing that Kenya violated the procedural requirements of the East African Community Treaty by signing the deal without properly consulting fellow member states. According to the government, the EPA, which has been operational since 2024, is crucial, underpinning nearly 1.2 billion euros in exports from Kenya to the European Union in 2023. In response, Cabinet Secretary Lee Kinyanjui announced that Kenya would appeal the ruling and pursue legal and diplomatic channels to reinstate the agreement. Kinyanjui also reassured exporters and investors that current commercial arrangements will be preserved for now and that full access to EU markets remain a government priority as the legal process unfolds. Meanwhile, the government has initiated consultations with other EAC member states to clarify the interpretation of Article 37 of the EAC Protocol, arguing that the clause should support transparency, not block sovereign trade initiatives. Given how much of Kenya's agribusiness flowers, fruits, and other fresh produce depends on the tariff-free European market access, the stakes are high. Prolonged uncertainty could disrupt supply chains, jobs, and export incomes. In Paris, the Court of Cassation has definitely affirmed the 2021 conviction of former French leader Nicolas Sarkozy, affirming he illegally overspent on his 2012 re-election campaign. The court rejected his final appeal on Wednesday, November 26, marking the final verdict. Sarkozy's sentence, a one-year prison term with 6 months suspended, stands, though under French law he may serve it under house arrest with an electronic monitoring bracelet, depending on judicial conditions. This ruling comes only 2 weeks after his release from jail, where he had been held while appealing a separate 2025 conviction related to alleged illicit Libyan financing of his 2007 presidential campaign. Sarkozy has consistently denied personal wrongdoing in the 2012 case. The Court of Cassation's decision deals a major blow to his political legacy and marks a rare instance in modern French history of a former president being held criminally accountable for campaign financing. Observers say the ruling underscores growing scrutiny over political funding in France, reinforcing legal standards around campaign transparency and fiscal compliance during elections. We will now go on a short break, and when we come back, the news will continue. Stay tuned.
The Papyrus Global, we don't just cover events, we create cinematic experiences. From red carpets to birthdays, gala dinners, and your fairy tale weddings, we bring your moments to life with high-tech precision. Our gadgets are smarter, our lenses sharper, and our team simply world-class. Trust the Papyrus Global to tell your story in the boldest, brightest way possible.
Welcome back, and now the news will continue. Kais Saied, the president of Tunisia, has formally summoned European Union Ambassador Giuseppe Peron to issue a diplomatic protest following a meeting between the envoy and leaders of the country's major trade union UGTT and employers union UTICA. The UGTT and UTICA were among 2015 Nobel Peace Prize laureates credited for facilitating Tunisia's democratic transition. The presidency accused the ambassador of violating diplomatic protocol by engaging with civil society actors outside what it describes an official framework. The EU responded by noting that dialogue with civil society, including trade unions, is standard diplomatic practice, and argued such engagement could strengthen bilateral cooperation and social dialogue. This confrontation adds growing tensions in Tunisia, where protests demanding social justice have been amplified amid a broader clampdown on civil society groups and dissenting voices under Said's administration. Somalia is facing a severe humanitarian crisis as a prolonged drought exacerbated by conflict and sharply rising food prices pushes millions towards starvation while humanitarian aid slows down. According to UN-linked forecasts, as many as 4.4 million Somalis could face crisis-level food insecurity between April and mid-2025 if rains continue to fail and aid remains insufficient. Already, millions are reported to be experiencing acute hunger, with the hardest hit being displaced families, pastoralists, and impoverished farmers whose livelihoods have collapsed. The aid slowdown the aid slowdown comes at the worst possible moment. With a record of drought, many communities have depleted food and water stocks. The cut in assistance risk undoing gains made in preventing famine, especially for children who are already facing worsening malnutrition, disease, and displacement. Humanitarian agencies warn of a looming disaster unless immediate international support is mobilized, including food aid, stable water supply, and funding for long-term climate resilience and livelihood restoration. US-based advocacy group International Rights Advocates (IR Advocates) has filed a lawsuit against Apple alleging that the tech giant continues to use mineral cobalt, tin, tantalum, and tungsten tied to human rights abuses, forced labor, and armed group exploitation from Democratic Republic of Congo and neighboring Rwanda despite public denials. The complaint filed in Washington, D.C. did not seek monetary damages. Instead, it demands a court declaration that Apple violated consumer protection laws and calls for an injunction to end allegedly deceptive marketing practices regarding its supply chain ethics. According to the lawsuit, According to the lawsuit, research, including a recent academic study, links three Chinese smelters said to be in Apple's supply chain to minerals successfully traced back to conflict-ridden mines in eastern DRC, regions known for child labor and violence tied to armed groups. Apple, for its part, states that it has no reasonable basis to believe such smelters currently in its supply chain financed armed groups. The company notes that 76% of the cobalt used in its product in 2024 was recycled, though IR advocates dispute the effectiveness and transparency of Apple's sourcing audits, given DRC's major role as a global provider of these critical minerals used in batteries, phones, and electronics. This lawsuit could pressure the broader tech industry to tighten supply chain transparency and accountability if court sides with the plaintiffs. And that's all we have on World News on the Papyrus Global TV. I am Christiana Babayu. Thanks for joining us.